question.
Hello everybody, quite a small select, but hopefully that's going to be useful in terms of generating discussion and so forth. I've taken the liberty, I hope you don't mind, Stan, of changing slightly the title I was given. So it remains the same, exemplary practice and research supervision, but I've added the words of personal view. And the reason I've done that is I'm hugely aware that there are a great many superb doctoral supervisors out there, and also that my background and what I do is a very particular bit of the world. And so I'm certainly not going to be prescribing in any shape or form what exemplary practice is. What I am going to do is share a little bit about my own practice, and perhaps from that there may be generalisable things that people want to look at, consider along the way. I quite like this picture, blowing up the award and making the person scratching their head quite small, because that's actually how I felt. On the night of the award, I was sat at the table and the announcement came out, and it was announced as Alice Young, which is also how Stan's referred to me today, whatever. And I sat there and thought, oh, thank God for that, it's not me. Because actually my name's pronounced Alice.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm not saying that in any way to be kind of difficult. It's just there was this moment of actually, really? And to be honest, since that point onwards, I've been scratching my head and going, oh, really? And one thing I would say about the awards, and this really echoes something you and Ken have wanted to do for a long time, is it actually forces all of us to think very carefully about our practice. What is it that we actually do that is so good and so enabling, and that will create the next generation of academics through our work? And just taking that moment to stop and reflect, for me, has been hugely valuable. So what I want to do is start with a few general comments, and then go on and look at some specifics that relate to, I think, what I've been thinking about in relation to my students and my journey. Does that make sense? Would that be helpful, useful? So, I suppose these are the general things I want to say, which I think are really important. On top of the list for me is that subject-specific expertise is a necessary but not sufficient condition of being able to supervise a student well. It's a distinctly different and specialised thing to do to enable students to learn, develop, grow. And just because you're damn good at your subject area actually doesn't mean you're going to be any good as a research supervisor. But equally, I see this a lot as an external examiner or a PhD examiner. It's really clear when a student has not been supervised by somebody who's at the top of their game, who doesn't know the literature, who's not current, and who's sort of been the person that kind of was convenient as the supervisor but is not really the specialist. So getting those two together is really important, and therefore I applaud all of the initiatives that are going on both in my university and other universities about helping supervisors develop their skills in practice. But I also think there's a threshold here, and at some point we should have the courage to say, actually, you're really, really good at your subject, but you're not necessarily a good supervisor. Because we would do that for teachers, why don't we do it for doctoral students? The other thing I'd say is that supervising PhD students, for me, has been a totally unique experience every single time. I cannot think of two students or two journeys I've been on with students that have been the same. I think doctoral supervision is a huge commitment of time and engagement and care. And the engagement is something I want to focus a little bit more on, because I don't mean process, I mean engagement. It doesn't begin and end with a start and finish of a PhD, which I'm also going to talk a bit about. And on a personal level, I'll say it's hugely rewarding and enriching, and it should be given far more recognition. So bravo to the UK Council for doing this. We might want to come back to these and think, actually, do we share these as general comments or not? Perhaps that's something we might want to come back to and discuss more. So, some more personal and specific things. Before I show you these and talk about them, I should tell you a little bit about my disciplinary background and the kind of students I work with. So, I'm a social worker, And another bit of my academic identity is I've worked alongside the deaf community for 25 years. So I'm a sign language user, and many of my students are deaf sign language users. So just to be really clear, sign language isn't a visual version of English. It's an entirely separate language. Okay? Both of those factors, the idea that social workers begin to do PhDs usually later on in their career. So I normally see older students who already have well-established professional identities and careers before they start their doctoral studies. And I usually see people for whom English is not their first language or their preferred language. Okay. So, bearing that in mind, I want to talk about a meta-conversation about writing from the start. This is something I do with every single student, and I always ask a new student, what kind of writer are you? And I can say hand on heart, no student has ever been able to give me an answer quickly to that. All students are slightly taken aback by it, either because they've never asked themselves it, or they've actually never been asked. And I believe fundamentally that running a meta-conversation about writing alongside the process of PhD supervision is absolutely vital. And it doesn't matter if you're a first language user of English is writing in English, or a second language user. Actually establishing that part of supervision is discussing writing is really important. One of the things I think it does is that it makes it okay to think about some of the challenges in a PhD from a student's perspective in terms of what I'm very fond of saying, which is writing to task. So if you say to a student, actually, writing your methods chapter is going to be a completely different skill and experience than writing your literature review, and is going to be different from how you present your results, then you actually give a student another way to actually think about what they're good at, but also what they find challenging. And it also enables you to begin to talk about those other things in a student's life experience that might be influencing their ability to produce a thesis, no matter how good they are. So I've called this the demons and angels from the past. So, for example, senior social workers who write court reports and write really excellent professional stuff every day of their life, many of them believe they can actually write a thesis with no problem at all. And a huge challenge becomes, oh, that moment when actually my skills perhaps are not quite the same for this task as they have been in other bits of my life. Deaf students in particular usually have had educational experiences that have demanded quite a, in my view, narrow view of learning English and narrow view of learning to write, or in some cases being forced to learn to speak. And therefore English carries with it a meaning that's not positive. And I think enabling students to find a way of articulating what it is that they can and can't do in the process of writing is ultimately a foundation for a good PhD. But also what happens is the students themselves start talking about it. So they start talking about, you know, I've got really good ideas, but I'm not quite there yet in how I articulate those. And it becomes safe to talk in that way. So what do my students actually do? These are examples from some of my research students who've had different challenges around writing. One of them regularly invited a friend for tea to talk to them about their work, and eventually as she was talking, she started typing. Because she recognised that actually if she sat there on her own with a piece of paper or with a screen, she couldn't do it. That was her solution. This thing about using first language, not using first language, I regularly say to students, actually I don't care about the English, at least in the early years. Put the English away, give me your concepts, your ideas, your critical thinking, because I'd much rather have complex thinking and poor English than really excellent English and sloppy thinking. But getting students to believe I really mean that actually is the challenge, because most of them don't. Most of them think I'm just saying that to make them feel better. but actually I really do mean it. Students drawing structures to the ideas first and then writing secondary. Students adopting this idea that writing to task is a particular style for a particular purpose enables you to break down some of this enormity that is a thesis. One student said to me, how do I do this thesis? By eating an elephant one bite at a time, and that's what she did. Go on courses, of course. I encourage students to go on courses for writing, all sorts of varieties. And this one, eat cake. I asked some of my current students, what is it? What's the motivational thing? They said eat cake, but remember the academic half stone. This is what my group refers to as that moment when you're writing up, when you're just eating neat things and you put on half stone. I think as a supervisor, finding alternative ways to enable students to stand back from being stuck is really important. I got stuck at different points in my PhD. We've all been stuck at different things that we do as professionals, as writers. And I think enabling students to find a way to stand back and be stuck and develop a language in which it's safe to talk about being stuck is really important too. And I use a lot of metaphor, and the metaphor tends to be linked to how the student interacts with me. It's not that I've got a formula for metaphor. So for one of my students, we spent a good year and a half talking about the thesis as building a dry stone wall, finding the right stone to put in, having the courage to take it down if the wall wasn't standing straight, not using cement necessarily, but just having the courage to say that's the perfect stone. And then what happens is the student comes back and sends me emails saying it's only one brick this week, but it's in the right place. Or comes back and says, I'm at the point where I've got to turn a corner, I don't know how to do that. So that metaphor gets expanded by the student as a way of talking back to me as a supervisor. Another student couldn't get past a general idea to a very specific set of research questions. So we drew out and played with the idea of cocktail glasses that start wide, start wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. And that this was a way of thinking about how to narrow down concepts and ideas that you're a PhD. And of course what happens is she writes back and says, yeah, it's lovely now. I'm actually missing the olive, not satisfied. Or the cherry's sunk to the bottom. And it opens a conversation, even when the student can't particularly articulate what it is that they're trying to say. With some students we've used mantras. Dory's just keep swimming, has actually been quite helpful for some students. It's that sense of if I hang on to that thing, it'll be okay. Other ones we've used are things like stay where you are, be in the present, because sometimes that's what you need to be at that point in your supervision work. This is one of my personal favourites. Some students get this, but some don't. You know the Monty Python sketch where somebody says to John Cleese, what direction? Where is such and such? And he replies, walk this way. And actually, it's an opening for doing a funny walk. And it's an elision of finding a direction and having a style of going there. And sometimes with students, they've got the direction, but they don't have a way to get there. Or they have a particular preferred way of doing things, but it's going in the wrong direction. So we use this and play around with these ideas. This was a couple of weeks ago from a student who emailed me and said, just letting you know, the red flag's in my hand and I'm in the trench. Nothing else, that was it. And then I opened up a conversation about, do you want to email, do you want to Skype, are you popping in for coffee? But this was a student who knew they could say that, but would find it more difficult to say, I'm really, really struggling. I want to talk a little bit about power. Whether we like it or not, because we're experts in our own subject areas, but because we are also supervisors, we have a huge amount of power. And I know there's a lot written about this in some of the literature around supervision, about equaling power and shifting power. Initially it's with the supervisor, and then as the student becomes more expert, they have greater power, that kind of thing. But I suppose what I want to say is that it's not just about expertise or competence. sometimes who we are as supervisors triggers things in students that actually ascribe to us power that's unhelpful from the student's perspective. So it might have nothing to do with the PhD, but has to do with their history. In relation to my work with deaf people, I'm a hearing person. I've always been a hearing person. I'm never not going to be a hearing person. Even if I become deaf tomorrow, I'm never going to be culturally deaf. My positioning within that supervision and that supervisory relationship is really important, because what I can't be is that dreadful teacher of the deaf that they suffered for 4 years, who was a hearing person who couldn't sign. So sometimes getting the identities that students ascribe to you out of the room because they're not relevant has actually been an important part of the supervisory process for me. Something I also do around power differentials is I'm very consciously incompetent sometimes, and I'm very consciously lacking in knowledge. So I will regularly say, particularly in the early days and all the way through, I don't know that paper. What are you talking about? Oh, would you share that with me? I've never read that. And what happens is, both that I'm modelling an openness around it's okay not to know, but I'm also modelling a sense that, come on, collaborate, this is a two-way process. Of course, the downside of that is that I end up over time with about 20 odd emails a week from students with papers they've just found that they think I haven't read that I might want to read, and can we talk about it next time we meet? But you know, the upside of that is I stay current in literature that I don't know. So yeah. Sometimes we read together, but also more to the point, having a peer group of students who read together, a peer group of students who exchange ideas, a peer group of students who moan and eat cake. That's really important. And I'm very aware in my group that a lot of that is sometimes, I've just had supervision with ALS and she's just said this, have you any idea what she meant? And I know that goes on, and that's good. Expectations of supervision. I think it's always worth interrogating this word supervision with students. What do they think it is? What are the meanings that they bring into the process that I'm unaware of? I mean, the one that always catches me out, particularly in social work professionals, because supervision in social work is something very, very specific, as it is also in other professions. And so helping students who are professionals to change their understanding and assumptions of what the supervisory process is about is actually quite important, and making that explicit. And I know there's all sorts of work on contracts and expectations and getting things like that clear at the beginning of supervision. I think that is right. But it actually says nothing about style. It says nothing about, as a supervisor, what kind of style do you have with a student? And what helps them to learn best. So I'm quite a kind of, I suppose, dialogic supervisor, so I'll ask lots of questions and I'll kind of worry about them with the student, and eventually the student asks questions and worries about them back. Other supervisors are much more, I think, task-focused than I am, which is why having a supervision partner who's more task-focused than I am is jolly useful on occasions. And just opening up the idea of different styles of learning and being aware yourself about what your own style is. I always ask students about preferences for feedback. I know what my preferences are. They're to write all over written text using that wonderful comment bubble kind of feature. But actually that's not everybody's preference. And if you have a student who has dyslexia or a student who has particular kinds of learning challenges, that ain't just going to work. So agreeing what preferences are around feedback is something I do a lot. Something I also try, and I don't always succeed at, but I try to hold on to as being really important, is this Rogerian idea of unconditional positive regard. Which doesn't mean that I always agree with students. In fact, some students drive me nuts. But actually there's something really important about remembering to positively regard the person within a process, whether it's conflictual or whether it's supportive. And sometimes that unconditional positive regard requires me to sit on the fence for a long time, to not give advice, to enable a student to make their own decisions and find their own way. But I think if we lose that sense of unconditional positive regard in our work with students, we've actually lost the student. The last set of things I want to talk about are trusting the process and containment. I mean by that sort of psychological containment, emotional containment. This quote, I want to stop doing everything for the first time, that's me. That was me when I was doing my PhD. I wanted to have an experience where every step of my PhD was not that I didn't know how to do something. And I see this in my own students. And when you're in that situation, you're not quite sure what something is, what the aims are, how to do it, you've actually got to trust your supervisors. But learning to trust the process and learning to trust supervisors is itself a process, it's not automatic. So one student quite recently said to me, I'm learning to trust the process. When I can't see an end, I've stopped saying, what's the end, what do I have to do? I let it go. But you need to tell me what are the likely problems I'm about to face. So she was saying, don't just say to me, yes, that's okay, that's part of the process. Tell me what the unanticipated problems are that I can't see as well. She has a good point. I think also I've encountered, I'm sure you have, students who actually want to be able to map out everything really clearly and then do it. And in fact, most of the time we know that that's actually not how PhDs get done. I think we have a role as supervisors in containing anxieties and maintaining belief for students when they don't have it themselves. To keep on saying you can do it, it's okay, this is a sticky patch, but it will be fine. And obviously with that goes actions like anticipating when it would help a student to have an interruption to their studies, or when it might help a student to go on a particular training course, that kind of thing. Something my students, more than one of my students has said to me at the end is, you never stop believing in me, and I actually never valued that. It never crossed my mind that that's what I was doing. But it was actually an important piece of feedback that several students had given me, that actually when they didn't believe in themselves, they felt one person actually did believe they could finish. And I think that's really, really important. But I didn't value it at all. Very quickly around before and after, I do a lot of talent spotting for my students. So yes, we have students who want to work at a university or want to work with you, but actually I often go out in meetings or in other events and think, actually that person would be really good doing a PhD. And the reason I do it is so few students, so few deaf people who are sign language users have ever gone into doctoral studies. So the British Deaf History Society keeps a list of the number of deaf people who've got PhDs, because it is so rare. And PhDs in subjects linked to deafness. My student who got her PhD just in December, I think we worked out she was number 18 on the list. We're talking very, very, very small numbers. So talent spotting is quite important. Finding funding or just finding a way. I've got a PhD studentship advertised at the minute because the University of Manchester has been lucky enough to get funded as one of the biomedical research centres in the country. And within that we have a section on healthy hearing, which has got absolutely nothing to do with the kind of work I do. In fact, a lot of the sections in that biomedical research centre are around curing deafness rather, eradicating hearing loss, genetic basis of hearing, that kind of thing, which politically is a million miles away from the kind of work I do and my group does. But actually it was a fantastic opportunity to get a PhD funded. So what we did was we created a PhD about the epistemological and ontological positioning of sign language users who use hearing aids as well, and what audiological services can learn from that. So it was a way of getting the studentship, fully funded, etc. Got advertised through the normal routes, and we put it on our Facebook page in sign language. In the first week, we had 1,018, no, I don't really mean that, yes I do mean that, 1,018 looks at it. How many people that will result in, I have no idea. But the point is we found a way to fund something that then was culturally acceptable. I think part of being a PhD supervisor is creating opportunities every step of the way. So mentoring students to do book reviews, mentoring students to write journal articles, publishing, teaching, all the sorts of things we all do. But it's also about afterwards, career support, interview practice, mentoring, horizon scanning for opportunities for our students, and fundamentally absenting yourself. Stepping back and saying, you don't need me anymore. Love you to know what you're going to do in your career, but actually you don't need me to be opening those doors anymore for you. So a huge privilege to be a supervisor, and with their permission, here are a few of my students, current or just finished. So on the left, your left, yeah. And this is Sophia and Rena, both social workers, one from India, one from Greece, who did their PhDs with me and are now working as lecturers and research assistants. In the middle, this was when Sophia got her PhD. One of the things I do is I get all my students together when somebody's getting their PhD, because actually seeing is believing. Somebody else who was crying 2 years ago, look, they're finished and eating cake. This is Katie, who, this poster we can do, it's in our student office. Katie was the first sign language user ever to get an NIHR studentship. She's now a research fellow at the University of Manchester. This is Tracy, who experienced a major life event in the middle of her PhD, took some time out, and then morphed into a priest. And this is Emma, who's the first deaf person who's ever interviewed deaf people who have dementia, who graduated in December. And they're delighted that I can share their images and some of their stories with you today. Thank you.
Before I hand over to Ken to chair, we've got about 15 minutes for questions. Do you want to take them, Ken?
Okay.
Yep. I told them they were getting the monkey. Now you're here.
Okay. Yeah. I do apologise. Our train suffered a 2-hour delay. I allowed an hour and a half leeway, but a tree fell on the line, and the preceding train hit the tree. So we were stopped about 5 minutes from Birmingham New Street because of trees, not leaves on the line, a whole tree on that line. Sorry, I do apologise. Yes. So questions, please.
Yeah, we haven't introduced ourselves, so I'll say who I am. I'm Martin Goff from West Liverpool. I'm also Moonlight as convener for the Society of Research into Higher Education Postgraduate Issues Network. I'm giving a plug. The next event is on the 22nd of March, which I'm sharing in London. And it's on intercultural dimensions to research study, including the question of language writing in a language not your own. And assuming your allusion to that wasn't just about those first languages of BSL, but international students who got this.
Yes, I mean, Sophia, the Greek student, English is certainly a second language. Rena, English has got to be 4th, 5th language, something like that.
But I just mentioned that because you mentioned about what sort of standard of English you're looking for, at least early in the process of researching for a doctorate. And that you're not concerned about how good the English is, what the English is at least at that stage. That's your position. I think we don't want to sort of take that as something to feed into our sort of seminar workshop next month. But as a supervisor, I would say I want to sort of see good English, because otherwise I can't see your criticality. I just can't see it in the writing because I can't work my way through it. That's my personal view of looking at this writing.
It's interesting. I mean, obviously, when students gain access to university like the University of Manchester, there is a standard of English that's expected. That's part of the application process. Okay. So when I say I'm not interested in English, the institution has its own entry requirement that's set quite high. But what I mean is that I come across students who are so concerned about saying it in good English that their ideas actually get watered down. They become less complex. And so at least starting out with the idea, free yourself from the worry about, is my grammar right, or, am I writing good syntax? And explore the idea, because I agree with you about criticality, definitely, but explore that idea, whether that's verbally or whether that's inside, and then think about, okay, is my written English going to match the complexity of my thinking? And if it's not, what do I have to do about that? But if we start, in my experience, we start the other way around, as I really want good English first, then actually I see students not developing their ideas or being too afraid to develop those ideas.
Eilish, you talked a lot about writing. Perhaps you could say something about reading as well, because I'm quite interested in working with my EdD students, PhD students. Perhaps we can talk about the differences if there are any later on. But I'm quite interested in being a reader of theory.
Yes.
Because one of the things they struggle with, like criticality, and these are people who are extremely competent in writing evaluative reports, and middle managers, often in higher education.
Yeah, exactly.
That's their skill base. They can do that at a drop of a hat. But there's no automatic transfer from those skills into doctoral skills, and it's an illusion. There's a feeling, I only have to do a bit more work and then I can do a doctorate. But perhaps you could talk a bit about being a reader, or being a reader of theory, because I think that's often a kind of a barrier or an area that they need to work on.
No, I agree. I mean, I said in one of my slides about reading together, but I didn't actually elaborate too much on that. So I think we all have students who are confident readers, and we have students who've never read a research paper in their life, and for whom actually the structure and density of that can be a barrier. So I think there's something about the form of the reading as well. Certainly with that, something I would do is have students together reading. So we would set a paper that we're reading together. Yeah, there might be students at different points in their PhD process, but where it becomes a source of discussion. Sometimes in terms of theory, I think it's really difficult, because we can teach theory through research methods courses and so forth, but it's not until a student actually has to apply it to their own work that they actually, in my view, begin to understand what really it means. It's certainly in the social sciences. So there's a bit of sort of doing alongside reading that's important. And there's some students that I think, actually I'm so pleased you did your PhD part-time, not full-time, because you needed the longer amount of time to absorb some of that theoretical underpinning. So students who might take 6 or 7 years rather than taking 3 can actually work to the advantage of that integration, I think. But I don't know what other people's experience is.
Actually, it's a question, it's not an answer to your question just there. Recently, I shared in my blog entry my own experience when I was an international PhD student, and it has something to do, it's linked to what other people said about critical thinking, because I came from a culture where criticizing or making critique is not encouraged.
Yeah.
So, and I said in my blog that actually that was something that other people did not see, even including my own supervisors, that was a barrier, a psychological barrier that I encountered, because they kept on saying that you have to be critical in your writing. But you see, inside me, I was panicking. How am I going to do that? I don't know how to do that. I wasn't trained to do that, even though actually it's not the lack of skill, but it's something else. It's like an invisible barrier that you feel that you shouldn't do it.
Yes.
And I tried to give an analogy, because when I was a student, I lodged with an elderly lady, and she kept on insisting, you have to call me Roberta, and I couldn't, because in my culture that is not acceptable. She was 83 at that time. I couldn't, and probably I offended her, by not doing so. But it was part of my culture.
Yes.
And have you come across that from your students, and how did you support students in this respect?
Yes, no, certainly, absolutely. I think it's most obvious, as you're saying, when students come from a culture where that kind of thinking and dialogue is actually not part of the tradition and not part of the educational culture. But I think it's also true for some students here in this country as well, where the idea of being critical about work that they really respect creates some difficulty. So I had a student from this country who said, I'm not sure I've got the right to do that. And for her that was a battle around self-esteem. In relation to students where I think there's been differences around cultural views, some of it, to be honest, has ended up being done by example rather than challenge. Because I don't think I've got any right particularly to challenge someone's cultural traditions that they're bringing into the room or bringing into that learning process. But what I can do is other my own and say, okay, in my culture or in the culture of higher education in this country, this is the sort of thing that we would expect students to do. Here are some examples of how students have done this or how writers are doing this, perhaps study some of those examples. So it's not the norm, it itself is othered as a cultural practice. And then it becomes more equivalent to be able to talk from one culture into another, if you see what I mean. The other thing is, at the University of Manchester, I can't remember this where it is, and I don't know who wrote it, but there's a really, really good online resource for critical writing for those who have come from alternative cultures other than the UK, that actually includes useful phrases. I know this sounds very stupid, but useful phrases like, think about the difference between saying describe or the author conceptualizes this as, and actually lists a whole series of things you could write in English that actually at the beginning of sentences give you ways into being able to make a critical statement. And after a while it becomes second nature, but it actually begins as, it's more than a vocabulary resource, it's a conceptual resource. It's really great. It's online, I can't remember where the link is, but it's online. I do give that to some of my students who find it very useful.
So I'm very interested in the dynamics of team supervision.
Oh yeah.
And I wonder, without kind of opening a different can of worms here, how, I mean, at Manchester you'd have panels, I guess, as well as the principal supervisor. How do you deal with, I suppose, disagreements between supervisors that directly affect the research students?
I think it depends on the kind of disagreement. So it's a Manchester system, there's always at least 2 supervisors. There's the option to have more than that if it's needed for a subject specialist. And also the student has a very separate, entirely separate from the supervision process, has an advisor who's actually much more about their personal welfare or issues that they may be dealing with, or has a separate overview of the supervision process. I think if there are disagreements that are connected with something substantive, theoretical, or something about the actual research itself the student's undertaking, I think I'm quite comfortable for those to be in the room, because I think that's quite important, that the student sees that supervisors from maybe slightly different backgrounds might have a slightly different view, provided the other supervisor is okay with that as well. I think disagreements that are much more about what the student should be doing. So a classic one might be, is the student on time or is the student behind? And I've been in situations where my co-supervisor has a different view than mine. And I think that's much more difficult to bring into the room. I think that's something supervisors should talk about first and then perhaps talk to the student about. I have had a situation where a student has requested that one of her other supervisors no longer supervised her, which, because of how the Manchester system is set up, we were able to give that to the advisor to work with the student through, and then the advisor actually had a role in talking to the supervisors about it. That was difficult.
Maybe one of the things that will come out of this meeting is that, as a set of scenarios, a set of case studies, and how people deal with these things. That might be one useful outcome. We'll see.